Now we've got the managing editor at Sabato's Crystal Ball, one of the best elections analysts in the country, Kyle Kondik. Kyle, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me.
So first up, I want to talk about turnout. Kind of how common knowledge goes is that in previous election cycles, high turnout all but guarantees a Democratic victory. But now it seems that lower propensity voters are breaking for Trump by a pretty decent margin. I've heard numbers like 7%. So how are you thinking about this? Like, is it that if we see record turnout, for example, this is good for Trump, or is that too reductive?
Look, I think that the parties kind of act in such a way based on how they deal with, voting methods and expanding that and voter ID and those sorts of things. The parties sort of act in such a way that Democrats seem to want higher turnout and maybe Republicans don't care as much about that. But the actual reality of like who high turnout benefits, I think is actually kind of muddier historically. If you go back 20 years or so, 2000 was a pretty low turnout election, the really close Al Gore, George W. Bush race. Turnout spikes in 2004, but Bush actually does better in that election than he did in 2000. So it's kind of murky over time. I guess the sort of conventional wisdom is that the pieces of the Democratic electorate, namely it's a younger electorate, it's a more non-white electorate, and it's also those groups have lower voting propensity than older, whiter voters basically. And so I guess the idea is that if turnout goes up, you've got more of those kinds of people who are voting. However, that's not necessarily going to be the case, and it also can be on a sort of a state-by-state basis. So, like a lower propensity voter in Michigan or Pennsylvania or Wisconsin might be a white working class man who statistically, certainly that person could be a Democrat, but they're likely to be a Trump voter.
Right.
And maybe it's different in the Sun Belt states that are more diverse. So it's kind of a muddle in terms of the turnout question, and it probably differs based on different states. I think what maybe the early voting could tell you, and I would be cautious about it, particularly making comparisons to 2020, but that if in fact Republicans are getting out, more people earlier than they did certainly in 2020, Democrats probably would want turnout to be higher just to sort of make up for that. And so, but again, I do think it's kind of a muddle.
Okay, so to that point then, we're seeing in some states that Republican mail-in voting is actually exceeding Democratic mail-in votes. So John Ralston of the Nevada Independent tweeted, GOP statewide ballot lead is 18,000 out of about 417,000 votes cast. So is something like that a blinking red light for Democrats, or does it simply mean that Republican voting patterns are just changing and that instead of those election day votes, we're just seeing them vote by mail right now?
It might be both. It might be that there's a change in patterns, but also that there's maybe some sort of Republican intensity advantage. I will say one thing that was telling, just the Senate Leadership Fund, which is the massive Republican outside spending group, they'd really ignored the Nevada Senate race between Democrat Jackie Rosen, the incumbent, and Republican Sam Brown. Rosen has generally polled a little bit better than Harris in that state, but they recently came in, so they must be seeing something in the numbers that they like. Now, you also get to the end of the campaign. Maybe there's just sort of money chasing media markets and that sort of thing. But I do think that was an interesting development. And at least one big Republican outside group is seeing something and sort of, actually putting money behind it. But I think there was also time for these patterns, if you're a Democrat, for things to sort of to sort of stabilize. So I'm still in kind of a wait and see mode. I certainly do recommend following John Ralston in Nevada. He's really been pretty good in the past. One thing that's making his job harder in terms of his early vote projections, he's talked about this, is that there's just an increasing number of people who are registered as neither a Democrat nor a Republican.
Right. That was going to be my next question, which is
what do you do with those folks? Because you could be in a state like Nevada, you could be generally pretty confident that the vast majority that these are going to vote D and the vast majority of the R's are going to vote R. There's some fluctuation there, but actually figuring out how the others are going to vote is a harder task.
Right. I mean, we're at just kind of slivers of a percent between Democrats and Republicans, and yet we still have basically a third of the entire electorate that's neither Democrat nor Republican. So at this point, trying to glean some information from those people is kind of makes the whole thing impossible. Like arguing over a third of a percent between Democrats and Republicans when we've got 28% of independents and we don't know how they're voting, kind of just throws the whole thing into chaos, huh?
Yeah, and also you got to remember, I think that just the voting patterns are just going to be different, and the election day mix is just going to be different in the past. I mean, I think what's probably likely in many different places is that the advance vote is just going to be redder than it's been in recent years, and election day is probably going to be not as red as it was
Right.
in recent years. But then the less vote, the less of a share of the vote you have going into election day, the more you got to make up on election day itself. But just to sort of show how these numbers have really jumped around in recent years, the pandemic's a huge reason. In 2020, 70% of all the votes cast in the United States were cast before election day. By 2022, in that midterm, it was down to basically a 50-50 split between election day and the advance stuff. So clearly, and granted, the midterm's a smaller electorate, but clearly you've got a smaller, advance vote going on there. I think what I've generally seen, and I think Ralston's written about this in Nevada and in other places, is that I think Republicans feel like they've got a lot to be excited about in the early vote. Whether it's predictive or not, I don't know. Look, if Trump goes on and wins, we could probably look back and say, oh, well, there were signs of it in the early vote. But the pattern, we've got such a kind of a small sample size and kind of a distorted sample from 2020 that I would just say maybe be a little bit cautious about it.
So on to the presidential map now. What's the status of the blue wall states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania? Because you've recently downgraded Michigan and Pennsylvania from lean Democratic to toss-up.
Yeah, we did that. We did it over the summer, particularly when Biden was sinking. We've had these 7 toss-ups for a long time. In Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania are part of it. I want to push back on a little bit of what I think is the sort of conventional wisdom out there. First of all, there is so much. There's like a story every day about Democratic panic in Michigan, and Michigan is typically, of these 7 key states we're all familiar with now, Michigan is typically the most Democratic of them. Not overwhelmingly Democratic, and not like it was in the Obama years, but I do think that is still probably the state that's the likeliest to vote for Harris of the 7. And again, that's not what the sort of narrative is necessarily. The polls kind of point to that, although the polls are all really close in all of these states. And also, if Harris loses Michigan, I don't see how she can win the White House, because I do think it's likelier to vote a little bit more Democratic than Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. The other piece I want to mention is that it's become a convenient shorthand to say, oh, the person who wins Pennsylvania is going to win the election. And that very well may be true. Pennsylvania is really important. It's the biggest of the 7 swing states in terms of electoral votes. True toss-up kind of state at this point, I think. However, I think that the way that the Midwest or the blue wall states typically vote, and again, we're talking about minute differences here sometimes, but that Pennsylvania is probably likelier than not to be slightly bluer than Wisconsin is. And I bring that up just to say that it's possible that Harris could win Michigan and Pennsylvania but still lose, because she could lose the Sun Belt states, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, and maybe Trump squeaks it out in Wisconsin and just barely gets over the finish line. Nevada, in terms of the math, Nevada doesn't really matter necessarily in that sort of construction. But just be careful about just saying, oh, Pennsylvania is guaranteed to vote for the winner. It probably will. And those blue wall states, historically, they've generally voted together. But there are going to be subtle differences. And, back when Biden was still in, the thing with him was like, hey, he's got to win Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin to have any chance. Honestly, I kind of still feel that way for Harris, too. I think if she wins those 3 states, she's in really good shape. If she loses even one of them, I have a hard time seeing her winning. Now, look, maybe you lose Wisconsin, you pick up Arizona, something like that. But I just think the sort of ordering of those states is such that I do think Harris needs all 3 of those industrial North states.
So I know the numbers right now kind of make it impossible to answer this question. So I'm going to ask it in a way that's more vibes as opposed to numbers. But who would you rather be right now between Trump and Harris as it relates to those 7 battleground states?
Let me put it this way. I feel like, and again, we call them all toss-ups, the crystal ball, our tradition, as we push all the toss-ups the day before the election. We're going to try to maybe do some of that before the day before the election. We're going to miss some. We hope we don't miss them all. But we feel like we cover this thing throughout the election cycle. We want to give people at least a little bit of a best guess as to where these states might end up. I personally, if you're just sort of looking at the states, and if you think, okay, Trump really needs to win that Sun Belt group, let's set Nevada aside. It's important potentially, but it's also the smallest of the 7. So Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, I think Trump probably needs to win all 3 of those to make his own math work. Just like I said, Harris probably needs to win the three northern states.
Yeah.
I feel a little bit better about Trump's chances in the Sun Belt than Harris's chances in the Rust Belt. So if you want to say that, hey, that's a small edge to Trump, like I guess maybe I don't feel particularly confident one way or the other about it, but that's just sort of how I'm looking at it right now. And I mean, the polls do bear that out, although it's the difference between like Harris being up, half a point or a point in Michigan and being up 1.5 points in Arizona or 1.5 points in Georgia in the aggregates. Like we're not talking about some sort of big difference here.
Right.
But that's just sort of how I look at it. You sort of need a microscope to try to find differences between these states.
Right. All of which basically fall into the margin of error anyway. And so we're just kind of like, yeah. So are there any bellwether House seats that you're looking at from which we can extrapolate the direction of the election on election night? Like we had a few of those in 2020 where we can say like Virginia 7th, for example, will give us a really good indication of whether Republicans are, or maybe 2022, whether Republicans are going to have, a red wave night or not a red wave or a Democratic overperformance.
Yeah, and Virginia 7 is a great example from the last election because that was one that it was, it's Virginia's, polls closing earlier in the night. And I remember looking at that district probably more than any other one early on election night in 2022, because that was sort of a gauge as to whether Republicans were going to build a big House majority. Well, they didn't win that seat. They didn't. I mean, they won the House majority, but it was not particularly big. In terms of places to watch like that, Virginia 7 again is like that. Eugene Vindman is the Democrat there running against Republican Derek Anderson. That's a Biden plus 8-ish seat. I think if that's a seat that if the Democrats are trying to get to 218 in a House, I would assume that would be part of a Democratic House majority. The other seat in the state that's really worth watching is Virginia 2, which is a Virginia Beach seat held by Republican Jen Kiggins. It's a narrow Biden seat. I would think if the Republicans were to win the House, that would be part of their majority too. On the other side of the border from Virginia 2, North Carolina 1, Don Davis, a Democrat. That's a Biden plus 1.5 or 2 seat. That's one the Democrats probably need to hold. And the early story of the House, early on election night, I think is going to be it's a lot of Democratic defense. And that Democrats don't have to win all of the seats they're defending, but they probably need to win most of them. And then you get into like New York later in the night, and New York's vote counts are always kind of weird.
Yeah.
Just governance in that state in general could be a little rickety. So be patient with New York. California always takes forever to finalize its vote counts, and there's a bunch of battleground states in California. But that's where Democrats play an offense in California and New York, and I suspect they're going to net seats out of both states. So that's good for them as they try to win the House majority. But Republicans have some opportunities for offense earlier on election night. We'll see if any of those come through for them.
And finally, I want to move over to the Senate. And according to Crystal Ball, it looks like the Senate right now, as it stands, according to your predictions, is, I believe, 48-51 with one toss-up, and that is Ohio. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah.
So
I think.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think Republicans are in good shape to win the Senate majority. To me, the bigger question is kind of how many seats they could get, because you can feel the floodgates kind of creaking here. Ohio, I think was always a tough state for Sherrod Brown, a state that's going to vote for Trump by probably high single digits at least. Yeah. That's still pretty close to competitive as far as I know. We have as a toss-up. But then you get into like Bob Casey in Pennsylvania, Lisa Slotkin running in the open seat in Michigan, and Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin. Like Trump wins those seats, there's a pretty high correlation between the presidential and the Senate results. So like if you're the Republicans, you're looking at this and saying, man, not only can we get the Senate majority, but maybe we could get like 52, 53, 54 seats. Like it's not out of the question for that to happen. And so they're really trying to make a late push to try to not just win West Virginia, Montana, and Ohio, but also to find some other seats.
Well, I'm curious about what your thoughts are on Texas, because it looks like to the inverse of what you've described in some of these other states, Colin Allred is actually making some gains on Ted Cruz. We've seen polling that shows Allred within a point of Ted Cruz. Obviously, that's not going to show in the aggregate of polls because the majority don't, but we have seen some recent polling showing him that close. How are you looking at Texas?
Yeah, look, that's definitely a competitive race. We do have Cruz pretty clearly favored there in our ratings. It says nothing about the margin. It's just basically about our confidence level in him being able to win. I do still think Trump is going to win Texas. and not just by a point or two. It was a 5.5 point margin in 2020, which really actually for Democrats is a pretty decent performance. Maybe it's somewhere around there. Maybe it's a little bigger. Maybe it's a little smaller. I think ultimately, Trump would get Cruz over the finish line. We have seen some more activity in that race. Speaking of this sort of late money movement, I mentioned big Republican outside group going into Nevada. Senate Majority PAC, Senate Majority PAC, the big Democratic outside group, they just went into Texas. I just saw the news break right before we started talking. $5 million, which Texas is gigantic, huge media markets, et cetera. But they are spending some money there now, so that's one to watch down the stretch. And then the other one that is notable is this race in Nebraska, where Deb Fischer, Republican incumbent, is running for re-election. That's typically a very safe Republican seat. But she's facing this independent, Dan Osborne, who really has made a race of it. Again, I still expect Fischer to win, but that's another one to watch. Democrats are trying to play offense somewhere. Now, Osborne is technically, he's an independent, so they're not going to be directly coming in for him. And Texas is challenging too, but they're trying to find some way to compete for the majority because again, Republicans are at 49 seats. They get West Virginia, which is basically automatic, and then Montana, where I think John Tester is pretty clearly behind at this point. So if you lose those, you didn't flip any Republican seats, you really can't win the majority. So that's where Texas and Nebraska hypothetically come in. But to me, the more competitive races are Ohio, of course, but then also that Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan group, and again that's Democratic defense as opposed to offense.
If you had to pick one race that you think might offer up a surprise result on Election Day, what would it be?
I guess Nebraska is really that really would be a surprise if Osborne won.
Yeah.
But it's such a strange situation because he's running as an independent. He hasn't said who he would caucus with. I think obviously Republicans are trying to pin him as a Democrat. And that's a state that Trump is going to win pretty easily at the statewide presidential level. But that would be one. And I would also say, on the other side in the Senate, it feels like the Nevada and Arizona races, the Democrats have been in pretty good shape in those. But if Trump really does well, gets over 300 electoral votes, carries those states, he definitely gives the Republicans a fighting chance to win those Senate seats. So, I think Democrats always knew that this was a difficult map for them. It looked, like they were holding on in some of these swing presidential states, and they very well still might. It's just that things really have tightened up, which maybe isn't that big of a surprise, again, given the connection between the presidential and Senate results.
And let's finish off with this. I know that people are going to hear you, based on the numbers as they stand right now. And a lot of these polls, by the way, I should caveat, are snapshots in a moment of time. They're not predictors of the future. But, people are going to hear you say Donald Trump does better in the Sunbelt states than Kamala Harris offhand seems to be doing in the battleground states. Do you have any disclaimer for people watching? Because, people are going to hear that and they're going to feel nauseous one way or the other based on what they hear at any given moment in time. So do you have any just general disclaimers as people dig into this stuff in the days before the election?
Yeah, look, none of the leads that either Harris or Trump has in these swing states are anything close to being definitive. And we've seen plenty of elections, particularly, 2016, 2020, Trump was underestimated by the polls. Obama was in 2012. You can't necessarily predict poll error from one way race to the other. I think it's enough just to say that the race is highly close competitive, or at least it is in the polls. We'll see how it actually ends up when we've counted all the votes. Look, this is an important election. They're all important. There are, people are, concerned about the state of the country and the direction of the country from both sides of it. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that if you really care about it, that you shouldn't be anxious about it either way, because again, it is important. What a lot of people say is that if you're feeling anxious about the election, people do have agency. Obviously, they can vote, but they can try to engage their friends and family and neighbors to participate. You can volunteer. You do see a lot of people who are particularly political professionals say that that's probably a better use of your time than scrolling Twitter or whatever. Yeah. Now, for me, who's trying to do a forecast, it actually is a good use of my time to be scrolling Twitter, I get, well, maybe it's not. I don't know, but I'm just trying to look for any sort of little pieces that I could try to figure this thing out. But it's just challenging. But I would also say that if the polls had actually been dead on accurate in 2016 and 2020, you would have had this feeling in 2016 and 2020 as well, because those were, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin decided by 78,000 votes in 2016, difference between Clinton winning and Trump winning.
Right.
2020, difference between Biden getting over 270 or not. Arizona, Georgia, Wisconsin, 43,000 votes. So this is why I say it's like, oh, wow, this is the closest election ever. Well, you got to wait for the results before you say that. Certainly the polls are suggesting that, but we can't expect the polls to be perfect.
Yeah, I mean,
you could come up with Nate Cohen at the New York Times has written about the polls this week. You could come up with a fairly compelling argument as to why the polls might be underestimating Trump again, or they might be underestimating Harris.
Right. Which I mean, that puts your initial argument on full display, which is, again, we have agency, and so rather than worrying about the polls, which are going to be close, but the election's going to be close anyway, so do something about it. Make sure that you are activating your friends and family, your networks of people, or volunteering with the campaigns that you care about. So with that said, Kyle, thank you so much for the work you're doing and appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks for having me.